Okay, I think we'll just go
It's a
ahead and
little
get
more
started,
guided,
right?
which is nice.
Okay. All right, everyone, we are going to go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. And we are here to talk about equity in verbal feedback. We know that there's been a significant rise in the literature around bias and best practices in written feedback and written evaluations. But our hope today really is to kind of consider the space around verbal feedback that we deliver to learners and colleagues all the time on shift and in real time in small tidbits, and it's harder to capture in sort of a more standardized way. So we're hoping to generate some conversation around real-time verbal feedback that's delivered in clinical practice. So we've got a really fabulous group of folks here today. We'll just very briefly introduce ourselves. I'm Kamna Balhara, I'm at Hopkins.
I'm Logan Wyatt, I'm also at Hopkins.
Hey, I'm Lee Irvin, I'm at Hopkins as well.
I'm Sydney Ellie Satterwine, I'm at Ohio State.
Hi, I'm Katrina Gibson, I'm Emory faculty at Grady.
I'm Daniel Ortega, Rising R4 at Cincinnati.
So we are going to obviously chat about what we know about bias in feedback, moving from the written realm to the verbal. We'll deliver and discuss some best practices in giving this verbal feedback to learners and colleagues alike. And then we have some cases to kind of work through, or scenarios where we'll have an opportunity to consider the quality of the feedback that was given and then kind of offer our own interpretations. Now I'm going to become like the QR code lady. There's another QR code coming. But we are going to be doing an art-based exercise. If you suffered through my keynote yesterday, you did it yesterday too, but there's different works of art this time. But the idea is just to get folks thinking about your own personal experiences with verbal feedback. And it's really not about the works of art that we're looking at. It's about you. So we want you to think about the times that you've recently given someone constructive verbal feedback. So not just an appreciation, but when you gave someone, hey, there are these opportunities for change or improvement. And we want you to think about what challenges or discomfort arose when you were trying to give this verbal feedback. Alternatively, you can think about a time that someone gave you verbal feedback and it was less than ideal. So we're trying to channel some of those more challenging experiences. And if you've scanned the QR code, you'll see a series of images, and we'd like for you to just share below the image if there's an image that sort of speaks to that experience that you had, and tell us why you chose it. We'll give folks just another few moments, and we're already seeing some comments popping up about the challenges of difficult feedback with the people that are rolling out the dough, learning from what you see, breaking sterile field, and sort of the tension between division of attention to who feedback is given to. And there's already some examples of feedback coming up here that folks are sharing. Does anyone want to, feel free to, if you want to share out loud with the group. We're a pretty small group in terms of if there is any particular experience that you've had or that you've seen happen.
I'll throw one out there.
Sure.
We have somebody that gives feedback in our department who's kind of widely known for saying they have a really nice smile.
It's So thank you all for sharing your thoughts and sharing examples. Sounds like there are already some themes coming up just from within our group. So I am actually going to now turn it over to Daniel to share with us some actual examples of feedback that have been collated from residents.
So, as someone still in training, in my final year of residency, I wanted to also prime the session with some real life examples. Essentially, I surveyed not just amongst my co-residents, but like nationally, and then like looked at forums and saying like exactly what type of feedback both residents and medical students, both in EM and outside of EM, were getting. And I kind of noticed like different things and categorized them as such just based on the survey I did. So sometimes you capture things with emotions, right? This is like kind of like a judgment of emotion. So you get the classic, oh, you're very aggressive, right? You're moving too fast. And it almost like, that suggestion is like belying like some sort of incompetency as a physician, like, oh, you're moving too fast. It's kind of like the idea, but you lead with the idea of the emotion. Or you're too quiet, you're lacking confidence, you're not leading the room, you're not doing the resuscitation well. Like, and again, these manifest in different clinical situations and contexts. But then there's some just outright like dismissals of personality, like you need to turn down your personality. What does that exactly mean? What part of the personality? The feedback isn't necessarily precise, but it's also like an overall judgment, like, oh, I'm just a terrible person. And then you get more obvious examples of like what would be an appropriate feedback, like appearance. But then you don't know if like you're using a veil of professionalism to just comment on your own personal preference if you're giving feedback on someone. So you don't look like a doctor. What does that even mean, right? And you can imagine how insulted this person may have felt. But then there's other examples where you would look more professional if you shaved when the person like was just a mustached individual, right? Like that's personal preference at the end of it. And then the final theme I saw is like either ignoring or assuming context. So imagine how someone felt, like a pregnant woman felt when they were told, they made it clear they were pregnant, but like early on and later on in the rotation, we're told, hey, you're snacking too much. Right, yeah, exactly, like completely ignoring the context that like, she's pregnant. It's a little comedic, but then, more insultingly, like to a heavily accented individual who speaks perfectly fine English, but has an accent being told, you need to speak English more fluently to your patients, right? Clearly there's a bit of bias in that as well. Or assuming context, saying like, hey, you have a new baby at home, that's probably why you didn't do so well today. Like, no one wants to hear that. No one wants to feel the weight of their poor performance because of like a life choice that they made, or maybe circumstances that they can't control either. So these are just a mishmash of the real life examples that unfortunately, like, where bias kind of instills itself in verbal feedback.
You can come up here, whatever you want to do.
Feel weird, like sitting and talking. All right, cool. So first of all, thank you all for being here on a Friday, the last day of conference. I feel like part of the thesis for this talk is that like the words that we choose really matter, right? Like, and we're all subject to words that describe our feedback, and then we're also giving our feedback. Even if we are a first-year resident, we're telling the med student, like, kind of tips for how they can perform better. And so for me, I've done some research in this area, and really like my push was to say, like, what do we know about this? Like, is this actually reflected in the literature? So first we're going to talk about what this looks like in terms of written feedback. So in 2017, I had a clerkship director at my residency program at the time, like in the fall, just be like, it's like, application season again. Like every season I see people, being described in different ways based on their gender. I just see like very stark differences. And I thought, oh, is that actually true? Like, let me look into that. And so we, in 2017, published a research article looking at the standardized letters of evaluation, the narrative portion, with respect to gender for our applicants in our institution. And we did find that women applicants in general tended to be described in more communal terms. So these are the terms that support sort of more attributes that relate to connection or empathy or being a helper, rather than the agentic terms of saying you are a leader, you are a master, you are a force for change. And you can all kind of imagine how that may impact how people are viewed in a professional sense. In contrast, those women applicants also were found to have a greater number of words that describe their ability. So that is in contrast to the general literature in letters of evaluation, and that probably attests to the more standardized format of the SLO and how that is good for letters. Dr. Miller, our colleague who couldn't be here today, then picked up that and first authored an additional manuscript looking at a larger population and essentially affirmed our initial results. In a systematic review in 2023, this was for 16 publications, of which our 2 publications were included, once again found that for gender, men were found to have greater agentic traits and women were found to have more communal traits. And in addition to that, the women applicants in letters of evaluation were found to contain letters with greater number of doubt raisers or references to physical appearance, like they have a great smile. So, looking in general at graduate medical education, so the next step, right, once you finally get into residency, in 2019, Klein's group found that gender impacts the traits that are used to describe performance, the consistency of feedback, as well as various performance measures. Rojek and Gorth found that women are found to have greater competency in letters of evaluation, yet personality traits always rise to the top in terms of greater frequency, and men are described just in general with more frequent terms related to competency. And then in 24, Klein found that comments about women in general tended to be more positive, but less specific. So you did great today, but like without that specific actionable feedback, like how are you going to improve, right? So that is definitely a sort of disadvantage. So we're like, wow, like the faculty in the room are like, we're like terrible at like, being a little bit, unintentionally biased, but actually the road goes both ways. So for the literature describing evaluations of faculty by learners, in 2019, Heath found that men were in general, the faculty were found to be described more as agentic masters or leaders, and that women were found to be more communal, empathetic, and warm. So thinking about what are the traits that lead to promotion, right? In 2023, Cullen found that women were rated lower for teaching effectiveness and role modeling, so maybe not perceiving those traditional sort of traits that would be aligned with those. And then Richter and Hobgood found that there was no parity at any rank after adjustment for years and race and in the department. As probably some of the prior literature and the impact kind of informs those markers for academic success. So then let's look at learners who are in groups underrepresented in medicine. So first we're gonna look at MSPEs, clerkships, med school performance. In 2017, Ross found that Black students had fewer standout and ability words in their MSPEs and clerkship evaluations. Rojek in 2019 found that students who are underrepresented were described more often as pleasant, so like personality trait, again, not like an ability trait, and knowledgeable, which is a good thing. And then Tirani in 2018 found that UIM students were then half as likely to have honors grades and then 3 times less likely to be selected for an honor society. And so we think about the impact of what we call an amplification cascade, right? Like the narratives in your clerkship evaluations go into the MSPEs, and then the MSPEs and the clerkship narratives then contribute to whether you're selected for an honor society, which then impacts where you end up going. Assessment for UIM learners applying to residency. So in 2020, Powers found that UIM LORs had fewer standout adjectives and more grindstone adjectives. So more like they work hard and not like they were a superstar. Right? So how does that kind of give you an impression of 2 different people? And then in 2022, L.A. Alvarez found that UIM EM applicants were ranked generally lower on all 7 qualifications for EM. So as a reminder, these are the 7. So commitment to EM, work ethic, ability to develop differential and a plan, ability to work with a team, ability to communicate a caring nature to patients, the amount of guidance that you predict the applicant will need, and then given the guidance, what is your prediction of success? So this is like a huge part for my role as an APD. of how I will evaluate an applicant to my program. And then finally, in 22, Kokolski found that UIM applicants in general were ranked lower than their peers universally.
Well, thank you so much for the tour through what we know about bias in written feedback. So let's think about this, right? That's stuff that we had time to sit down, think about, write, backspace, delete, edit, have multiple people potentially read it. So what happens when we're just giving feedback on the fly? So we know that verbal feedback is great, right? It's a great thing to do on shift. It is a meaningful interaction that generates interpersonal connection, and it's bidirectional. It allows the learner to bring in their insights as well, which in a written feedback form wouldn't be possible. And it's also great because this is a really great study, but it tells you that verbal feedback compared to no feedback is good, which I think many of us probably would have realized, but it does show improvement in task performance in the workplace. And there is some suggestion that feedback that's given in real time may be more specific and more effective than something that you receive at the end of your rotation, which makes sense. But verbal feedback is fraught, right? I think we kind of alluded to some of this already, but it is impossible to standardize speech. You cannot, enforce uniformity the way that you would in the format of the slow, right? Because people are talking. You can't backspace. You can't take it back. You can't just reverse a couple of seconds and be like, I shouldn't have said that. And we're often giving this verbal feedback in our very high pressure clinical settings where time is extraordinarily limited. You don't really have time to mentally prep what you might say. And what you're saying is equally important as your posture. Are you sitting? Are you standing? Are you making a face? What does the tone of your voice sound like? So there's a lot more variables that can inject bias in simple words. And oftentimes, think about the last time you gave or received feedback. I know for me it was in a hallway, right? With someone pushing a patient past or another colleague walking past. So privacy is also a potential concern and may also guide the sort of how candid our feedback might be. So verbal feedback can be challenging, especially when we're providing criticism or constructive feedback. So learners may perceive any kind of constructive criticism as a negative reflection of their self-worth. And when you're giving that feedback verbally, then you then have to manage whatever emotional reaction you might elicit. But our fear of not being liked, our fear of damaging our personal relationships can really impact how open we are with our feedback. And this extends to residents as well. So in one study, nearly half of respondents felt that they would self-censor negative comments when they were the ones giving feedback verbally to a more junior learner. And there's also some suggestion that fear of retaliation, for instance, resident evaluations of faculty, may also impact the ways in which faculty provide feedback. So, it kind of generates this perfect storm for bias. It's emotionally heightened, it's multivariable, and you can't take it back. But unfortunately, even though there's a wealth of information on written evaluations and feedback and bias, I don't think it's surprising that there isn't as much known about bias and verbal feedback. I was trying to think about how would you do this in a study? You just follow someone around and there'd be so much sort of bias from their perspective that they're being observed. It's very challenging. But there is one study out of South Africa that, obviously it surveyed people on their experiences, but they did find that if you were a male resident, you were much more likely to feel that the feedback that you received was based on concrete observations, it was given in a non-judgmental way, and it wasn't influenced by your other characteristics. So some perception of experiencing higher quality feedback if you were a male resident. And they didn't find any differences based on the individual giving feedback or their gender.
We know one of the major issues, however, though, is that bias exists even in areas where you're trying to control it when you're training faculty as well. The bias exists, and this can manifest in verbal feedback. And this is also where we identify there is a scoping literature review that was done recently by Mandigliani. Essentially, it showed that most of the feedback that is being given to students, most of the feedback for students that has been studied so far is not verbal feedback. There is a gap in the literature, and that's the particular focus that we want to bring to the table.
Oh, it did update.
Okay, did, no worries. Okay. So we've talked about a lot of the gaps, holes, and difficulties with verbal feedback, but there are still some things within the literature that we hope that you can apply to the way and format in which you give verbal feedback at your institutions. And one of the most important things that we'd like you all to do is find ways in which to strip away the bias. So some of the things that we've discussed before is you make sure that your feedback is actionable and specific. A lot of times, your shift may have run over, you're running out of the room, and you just give them a thumbs up and say, good job. As opposed to, you communicated the information to this patient that you were discharging in a way that was appropriate for their level of understanding. Be clear and consistent. Of course, if whatever you're relaying is not understandable by your resident or your medical student, then perhaps they're not going to be able to improve in your next shift. And what about consistency? Maybe some people you're giving verbal feedback in the middle of your zone, whereas other folks you're able to pull aside. That can change the level of transparency in which you are giving them feedback, and also maybe even how they perceive it and are able to act upon it as well. Another thing that is often gendered is we often conflate confidence versus competence, right? And there's nothing more concerning or possibly even dangerous than an overly confident resident and or medical student who may not be competent and can put patient care at risk. And we also talked about gender-based stereotypes, whereas women or those who identify with a female background are more likely to, receive some sort of feedback about their kind of more touchy-feely types of things as opposed to actionable and procedure-based feedback. And what about real-time feedback? Time is also often of the essence in these busy shifts, but if you can circle back about a patient interaction that just occurred, pull them aside right after the bedside as opposed to you pulling them aside maybe a week or two later, it's fresh in the mind. You can comment on specific actionable items in their efforts of patient care. Now, the next one, implicit bias for faculty and evaluators with the recent executive orders, and depending upon where and how you practice, that might be a little bit more difficult, or it might even be necessary to use a different term, but we need to, as evaluators and attendees, be able to strip away some of the terminology that might be biased as we're giving feedback. And standardized feedback tools are important as well. That's much more easier when it's written feedback to kind of click the boxes. I'm sure all of our programs have that, but when it comes to verbal feedback, try to develop some sort of standardization as far as certain terms to use that are actionable, the location, and or the time in which you give that feedback. And also, make sure that your evaluators have some time for self-reflection. The thing about implicit bias is while they may not be explicit, it's still possible to identify them and make sure that they are actionable. And some of the things that these photos are to represent is that identities take many forms, whether it's our race, our gender, our nationality, our ethnicity, our religion. So think about those ways in which how people may identify and how that may impact how they receive and or perceive your verbal feedback or how they interact with patients as well. Other things to think about is, what identities are centered and are valued within your institution, and how does that make your learners feel as well. The next term we want to discuss is intersectionality. Does anyone recognize the individual to the left of your screen? If not, this is Professor Kimberly Crenshaw. She is a professor of law at Columbia University. She is also the director of the Center for Intersectionality and Social Policy Studies. And while the term intersectionality has been used in the 19th century, the earliest 19th century, the manner in which we use it today came from a paper that she wrote in 1989, where we talk about the manner in which all of our identities, from our race, our ethnicity, our socioeconomic status, our religion, etc., intersect, intercollide, and impact our experiences and how we interact with each other. So it's important to think of all of these identities, the way they interact and or intersect in order to create biases, and how that may impact how we give and receive verbal feedback to our learners.
Good morning, everybody. So I'm going to take over here, and just a quick reminder of what Simiao already covered, so we're not going to go into it that much, but women do tend to more often be ascribed communal characteristics, while men are more often ascribed agentic characteristics. I think one of the big holes in the literature that we don't talk about is lack of information on non-binary individuals, and so sadly for this entire talk we just don't have information there, but want to acknowledge that lack in our own knowledge and the greater literature. Another thing to consider is stereotype threat. So stereotype threat is this phenomenon in which performance is impaired due to fear of confirming negative stereotypes. And stereotype threat historically has been sort of considered the concern for confirming negative stereotypes, but it really can actually cut both ways, where your fear of conforming to a negative stereotype or your attempt to conform to a positive stereotype occupy your cognitive space, and that can impair performance. There's also this concept of protective hesitation, and this is something that I really want you to think about before giving feedback. So when providing feedback across identities, these interactions can be sort of mitigated by protective hesitation. That's essentially the idea that in that interaction, people avoid talking about identities, and most often this comes up in the setting of race and gender, where these are sort of taboo topics that we don't want to talk about during the feedback interaction, and that protective hesitation actually prevents us from going deeper and truly understanding each other. So when providing feedback, especially in sort of the verbal space, it's important to allow that discussion to address those identities. Your learners may well want to talk about the path that they've taken, and if you don't offer them the opportunity to talk about sort of how race, gender, or other identity has affected their experience, you can really lose out on the richness, and like the feedback can become much more bland, and you really can miss an opportunity by employing protective hesitation. And potentially there's this idea that protective hesitation and stereotype threat can combine to this idea of vanishing feedback. So I'm going to read a quote here that I think really describes this idea of vanishing feedback perfectly. The well-intentioned teacher talks around the problem or uses such indirect statements as to obfuscate the message entirely. The student, fearing a negative evaluation, supports and reinforces the teacher's avoidance. This results that despite the best of intentions, they're taking the time to do this feedback, nothing of any real value gets transmitted or received. So what we all want to do is avoid this kind of feedback and really consider avoiding protective hesitation. We also sort of want to send a reminder of the various different biases that can pervade both verbal and written feedback. There's this idea of affinity bias, which is where you ascribe positive attributes to those with similar experiences and not based on observable behaviors. There's also consensus bias, and you can certainly see this in CCCs and other places where we're evaluating residents, where you assume that your own thoughts are shared by everyone. Certainly, there's the idea of recency bias, where you provide feedback based on something that's recently happened. And this is definitely a problem with end-of-shift feedback, because a resident may have had many good things that they've done throughout the shift, but if they screw up right at the end, you're going to give them negative feedback. There's also this idea of primacy bias, where you're overly focused on a negative initial impression, and I think this often happens with residents who get labeled as problem residents. Once they're a problem residents, that idea or that bias will color their feedback they receive the rest of their career. There's also this idea of contrast bias where you compare residents to each other, and I think this is really, like, especially in CCCs, an area that you compare one resident to the other as opposed to the standard, the metric, or the competency. And this is actually at odds with the idea of competency-based education. There's also the halo effect where you form an overall positive view based on one or two positive qualities and then ascribe positive qualities throughout the rest of the evaluation. Or the horns effect, which is where a negative perception dominates and then persists. There's an error of central tendency as well, where everyone is average, regardless of their actual performance, or this idea of error of leniency, where everyone is great, regardless of their actual performance. And I think you can imagine back to your medical school or residency experiences where you know those evaluators who gave all 3s or all 5s, and that is just demonstrating error of central tendency and leniency. And you might think about your own evaluation. Are you a central tendency or a leniency person? So sort of reflecting on what Simiao said before, there's a few steps that you can take sort of along the path while providing verbal feedback. And really the first step prior to the assessment is doing what you're doing right now. You're preparing yourself. You're thinking about the biases that you might have. Obviously, it may get more difficult given the current climate to really prepare yourself, but I commend you all on being here on a Friday and doing just that. It's important to familiarize yourself with the assessment criteria prior to observation. So we may not have all the milestones at ready availability when we are evaluating, but I think it is incumbent on us to familiarize ourselves with those things that are required of our learners before we do the assessment. During the assessment, again, we're going to try to focus on observable behaviors, and that is going to be much easier to do, as Katrina said, if you give the feedback in real time or as near to real time as possible, because the longer the time passes, the less likely you're going to remember those observable behaviors. And then finally, it's important to seek feedback on your feedback. I know it's a bit meta, but have a colleague, a supervisor, somebody give you some feedback on your feedback, because we're all learners, and without feedback, we don't improve.
So when making the decision to meet with your learner and then to try to give verbal feedback, we thought there were some important strategies that you should sort of keep in mind. The first is this idea of the same rules as sending out an email, right? You got to check where you are psychologically, right? If you're mad and something like pissed you off that day, that's probably not the right time to be able to engage in constructive feedback. You might want to pause and sort of choose an alternative time to do so. It's also important to plan and prep. And so when you begin a shift for the learner, maybe ask that learner, what things are you working on? What things can I specifically try to observe and make comments on behavior to help you move along your trajectory? I like this approach because it shows more like a teamwork approach, and it shows that you're really committed to helping that learner progress along the pathways that are important to them. Place matters, and so does time. And so, Kamna alluded to the fact that a lot of times we're giving this feedback in a hallway where people are walking by, they can see the facial expressions, they can see what's going on. That is not the appropriate setting to be giving somebody constructive feedback. So, step away and go into one of the nutrition rooms or some spaces private where you guys can sit down together and really engage respectively. If you're doing a procedure, you might want to give that feedback, closer to the timing of that procedure if there's something specific that you want them to learn. But I think it's really important to be thoughtful about when you think is the best approach or best time to do so. And it's important to say what you mean. A lot of times we'll communicate with our body language or our facial expressions. I'm notorious for not being able to hide my facial expressions. It's important to actually communicate what it is that you actually want to say verbally. The way that our brains work, visual feedback is very different than oral feedback. And so the oral feedback is what sticks for learners. You want to focus on observable behaviors and not character traits or identity traits. And you want to use feedback as a corrective tool. You know, we want our students, our learners to have a growth mindset. And the whole point of feedback is to help them get to where they want to be. And I think we have to make sure we keep that philosophy. And just be really mindful of the words we use, the tone we use, because I think that's ultimately how that learner is going to experience what it is that we're trying to say, and that matters. I think it's also important to recognize that our students, our residents, they're humans. They're humans with a greater context around them. There are students that have overcome tremendous things to become where they are. There are students that are struggling in the moment and have a lot of eyes on them because of the challenges that they've been having. And so I think you have to recognize who that learner is, what contextual factors are potentially impacting how that learner is performing, and be mindful about that, because it's going to affect how receptive they are to feedback and how you might want to broach that feedback with that learner. I think it's also important to recognize that there's innate power structures at play, right? Our learners are looking at us to help them get jobs, help them get residencies, help them get fellowships. And so innately there's this power differential that can interfere with people really kind of engaging in a really impactful conversation. So sit down with the learner, look to them eye to eye, and really engage in a conversation as opposed to some sort of power play. And you want to move beyond procedure. I know there's a lot of focus on the different sort of competencies that we're trying to measure for our learners. But we all know that as immersive efficient, it takes a lot more than those competencies to do this job well. And so recognizing all the strengths that these learners bring to the table, and the fact that the people that we match to our residencies, the people we match to our fellowships are amazing individuals, and we need to sort of see them for the human that they are, as opposed to these sort of myopic competencies that we're measured by. And as Logan said, it's important for us to enact reflection and make sure that the things that we're saying are certainly making the impact that we want them to, and if not, to think about how we can do that better. And as you would imagine, this isn't always going to go well. And so it's important to prepare for negative experiences or negative reactions or people being surprised by what it is that what you're going to say. And this is more likely to occur when there's a lack of concrete examples. When you throw out some concept and you don't really have any evidence or any specific behavior behind it to adjudicate what it is that you're telling the learner that they're struggling with, I think that's always a challenge. Relying on subjective data as opposed to direct observable behaviors that you can let the learner recognize are challenges and areas for improvement for them. Trying to compare that learner to somebody else is also fraught. Recognize we're all trying to do the best that we can to be the best me, the best you that you can be. It's not about you trying to be the next person in the room, and so try to avoid that as well. And then feedback that focuses on areas where one thinks they're doing really well, but you're not necessarily thinking that their performance was all that great. So that sort of dissonance is something that can engender some negative reactions. So just be prepared for that. And when you do incur negative reactions, I think it's important to explore why, right? Do curious questioning. Try to figure out what that learner's experience, what their perceptions were, because I think that can result in a much richer conversation and really help you to develop a collaborative plan to help address whatever the challenges that you feel like the learner was enduring.
I think we'll just stay in one big group.
Okay.
Because
Okay.
we'll just go through the cases.
Yeah. So we thought that we would maybe give a few scenarios and maybe chat through some scenarios that I think I certainly have experienced. Many of these are seeing these things throughout my time as a student or a resident or sort of faculty member as well. And so the first scenario, you have a female resident who's working with one of her male attendees, and after confidently leading a trauma resuscitation, the attending offers feedback. You kept the room calm, you're very composed and nurturing under pressure. That's a great strength, especially for a woman in this environment. He pauses and then adds, you don't have to be loud to lead, and that's refreshing. All right. How do you guys feel about that feedback? Is it good?
Especially for
So what do you feel that they were communicating with that statement?
and it's definitely I think it reveals an inherent bias of the reviewer, and it implies that women are less likely to be composed under pressure. Also, the word nurturing is weird.
Mm-hmm.
That's another issue.
So some stereotyping at play, huh?
It really focuses on like the energy and not like the concrete behavior. Like I'd be more interested in like how you delegate tasks, how you engage with social communication, like how you recognize the differentials and exams. I think that I would probably focus more on that if they love the resuscitation well, and maybe less on the energy.
Yes. There's all these phenomenal behaviors that this learner did to run that show. And they focused on their own stereotypes instead and chose to push that on the learner as opposed to really like highlighting all the direct observable things that you want that person to continue to do moving forward. Yeah. Any other thoughts on this case?
I doubt that a real resident would get this feedback. It would be very specific about actions that they took and not about emotionally being supportive.
Yeah, indeed, right? And so it's going back to this idea that we like to focus on these communal or social traits of learners that identify as female and are much more agentic when we approach the way that our sort of male colleagues are working. Great. Katrina, you want to do the next one?
And I'll just add that, like, I love this example because you can tell that if someone brought this to the attending's attention, they would say, well, it was well-intentioned, right? They're not trying to insult this person, but it's a really key moment to check their bias, and who's going to check it? That resident is unlikely to be like, hey, you kind of have, like, some weird assumptions about women here. So that's why I think that getting feedback on your feedback is so key and something that we just don't do in clinical practice as much.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Intention versus impact. All right, scenario number 2. So we have a Black female medical PGY1 is working with her female EM PGY3 resident who happens to be Filipino American. The intern presents plans assertively and asks thoughtful questions. At the end of the shift, the resident says, "You did a good job today. Just be mindful of your tone. At times, it came off a little strong. Patients and staff can be sensitive to that." She adds, "It's important to be approachable." We'll let that marinate with you all for a moment. Imagine this occurring. Maybe witnessed it, maybe we've used some of this terminology, but how might this feedback be shaped by both gender and racial bias? How do some of the words like, oh yeah, go ahead.
I actually have something kind of similar to this background as a medical student. I worked at the ED actually for something, and I was like, oh, I'm in an emergency medicine position, and the person who came in said like, oh, don't forget that you always have to dress nice and wear makeup and be at the party, or else people won't respond to you. There was like a female attending, and I was just like, it was really weird. One, I was a patient, so it was so strange, but but I think she was trying to look out for me. The underlying thing is that she was trying to help me advance my career, and she thought that was how you were supposed to do it. And here's some advice when you're young and early on. This is some of the things that you need to do. And so already structurally, it was more about the circumstances that she was under, and wherever she worked, and how she got to the position she got doing things. She said this is how to be successful. So I think this scenario is kind of similar. You're looking out for another underrepresented minority group who's also a female. And so you might think that you have to be more approachable. So you're assimilating, and then you're thinking that this is how we play the game. And I think what you guys are trying to do is trying to flip place where the game's gotta change, not, like this person, I think is trying to be helpful.
Of course. All right. And this just reinforces what we were talking about before. Sometimes when intentions and impact don't match, it does not diminish the impact. And when you focus on the impact of your words or your actions, it really focuses and centers the person who has been hurt by the action. And I think that's an important point. Yes?
This reminds me of protective hesitation you guys were talking about earlier. This kind of feels like a situation where she's like dancing around this idea that maybe like a young Black resident is going to like be perceived in a certain way, and she is trying to protect her from that maybe, and she's dancing around with it. I think maybe one way she could just explicitly say it, like it's not fair, but like there's going to be times where like if you come off this way, people are going to take it poorly because you know how to guard it's not okay. But I would really steer away from that unless you have like a concrete, specific encounter. Like if there was an encounter where something happened and like there was like a poor response, and she's just like, if there wasn't a specific incident where you can really like pull up some evidence and some data and go through it, tell me what you're feeling in this moment, like here's what it seemed like from my side. But if you can't do that, I think I would just not make that comment.
Of course, because I mean, this also speaks to who's allowed to be angry, who we are more likely to tone police. Like I couldn't walk into the trauma bay and throw things and scream and curse without my professionalism coming into play, whereas someone who's maybe perceived as a white cisgendered heterosexual male is just being fiery and passionate. So this speaks to who's allowed to be angry, how our environment perceives us based upon the intersectionality of our interactions. Dr. Blunt.
I also think some of this, like I've been present when I've heard this feedback before, this almost exact same scenario, or I've been approached by a PGY3 resident about a PGY1, and I've heard things, like about their tone or that they've come off a little strong and they're not approachable. And this feedback is so subjective. It's based on what the PGY3 is, perceiving at that point in time. And I've been, sometimes heard this feedback, and I'm like, I completely disagree with that feedback as well. And so I think it's just, mindful to be mindful to be open to, what you're perceiving is not necessarily the right thing. And I think a lot of times when we're giving feedback, we, have this, ego that we lead with sometimes. And I think sometimes it's important to kind of take a step back, be humble, and understand that like your perception is not always the right perception, and you might be thinking that someone is being, loud or not approachable, but maybe your own biases about how you react or how you're interacting, or how you perceive somebody else isn't actually like what's actually going on in the real world. So I think it's always important to kind of just check that in your head and take a step back.
And it's like a great opportunity to get other data points.
Yeah.
You're trying to go on, but strong to me means nothing. I don't know that is not an actionable thing that I can do as a person receiving feedback. I don't know what you want me to do to change. All you're doing is making me feel uncomfortable in any your future interaction with anybody. And like how you become approachable, again, what does that mean? That's all, and again, this is because it's filtered through the bias of the person delivering that advice. But it's unachievable. And so if you're feeling strongly enough to give that type of feedback, you should feel strongly enough to work harder on the words.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. You pointed out that our feedback must be clear, concise, and actionable. No, in the interest of time, should we do one more? Okay, our final scenario, number 3, is a male attending is working with a female NP. The NP suggests a diagnostic approach for a patient with nonspecific symptoms. The attending responds with a skeptical tone. That's one way to go. You tend to be pretty cautious. I guess that's your style. We need all types, right? He ends with a chuckle and says, that's that maternal instinct coming through. So what assumptions are embedded in this feedback? And I guess these are more explicit as opposed to implicit biases, but how might the language maternal instinct influence how a clinician sees her professional tone? And how can attendings move away from personality-based feedback toward more skill-based guidance? Or even maybe there's a difference in the hierarchy between an NP and an attending versus a resident. this is on the more egregious side, but what are some things? But these types of things happen, though. So I know we laugh amongst ourselves, but unfortunately, this type of feedback and interactions happen clinically. So if we can take anybody's thoughts, critiques.
I think the fact that it's attending an NP, I mean, like you said, this is pretty explicit bias and not implicit, so there's lots of problems here, but I think it's exacerbated by the fact that it's attending an NP because while the way the feedback's given is obviously problematic, you could imagine a good faith discussion that is helpful to a resident about practice variation, being more cautious at some times and being less cautious, and discussing different ways that the learner is going to approach things going forward as they go into independent practice. The fact that it's an NP who's an independent practitioner, I mean, none of that applies. Like, this is really just sort of, pardon my language, like just kind of shitting on someone.
Calling a thing a thing.
I feel like each sentence gets worse. The more you just ask goes down.
Sure, maybe this attending has biases about the training and preparation of NPs. There's gender. There's a lot of biases that seeps through. But unfortunately, these things happen, and you cannot change what you don't acknowledge and or measure. So.
Well, I know we're at 11:50, so thank you, everyone. Thanks so much for participating in the conversation. And hopefully this is an area where we can start to dig out some more pearls and some more evidence around how to best conduct this feedback on shift. So thank you.
All right, safe travels, everyone.